the air war against Germany. This build-up of men and material was recognized as an essential first step to an invasion of France. In 1942, however, insufficient forces were available for an operation of this magnitude, and most of those arriving would later serve in the Mediterranean. In 1943, the Mediterranean remained the principal theatre of operations, but the build-up of men and equipment in Britain continued. At the end of the year, Allied plans for a cross-channel attack took a step nearer to realization. At the Tehran conference, the decision was taken to launch Overlord no later than the summer of 1944. The area selected for the landings was a sector of the Normandy coastline within range of Allied fighter cover mounted from bases in Britain. The Calvados coast was part of the Great Bay of the Seine and enjoyed the advantages of good beaches and comparatively sheltered waters. Assault landings would be made on 5 separate beaches. In the west, American forces would land at Utah and Omaha beaches. In the east, the British and Canadians would land at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Airborne forces would be deployed on the flanks, inland of Utah and on either side of the River Orne. The objectives of the first day were to link up the 5 separate beachheads into one continuous lodgement, 5 to 10 miles deep, to secure the principal roads and river crossings, and to throw a cordon round the city of Caen. In the days immediately following, supplies and reinforcements would be brought ashore, and the lodgement extended and strengthened. While the principal objective in the east would be the consolidation of Caen, the principal American objective would be the isolation and capture of Cherbourg. This would provide vital harbourage and an extensive rear area for the disembarkation and assembly of follow-up forces. The main thrusts of the offensive would then be mounted from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula towards Brittany and from Caen towards Paris. To ensure the success of Overlord, air and naval support was seen as crucial. Naval forces would be required for mine clearance, convoy escort, and fire support. But in the months preceding the invasion, their primary task would be to secure control of the sea lanes between Britain and the continent. These operations were complemented by air attacks on enemy shipping and by attacks on ports and harbours on the continental coast. From the end of 1943, Allied air power was primarily focused on the wider objectives of Overlord. The transportation plan, adopted by Allied planners as the most effective means of furthering these aims, called for a systematic offensive against the infrastructure of France and the Low Countries. Initially, this offensive would be concentrated on the railway system, the marshalling yards, repair shops, and major junctions. But as D-Day approached, the scope of operations would be widened to include all transport targets, as well as signals, communications, and radar networks. The purpose of the plan was to paralyze the enemy's command and communication systems, to isolate the Normandy beachhead, and to prevent the rapid deployment of reinforcements and reserves. During the battle itself, air power would play a key role, providing fighter support, close reconnaissance, and roving artillery. Hitler's strategy for the defense of France rested primarily on a series of coastal fortifications known as the Atlantic Wall. Construction of the wall had begun early in 1942, when the prospect of an invasion was still distant. Priority at this time was given to the protection of military installations and major ports. Work on the wall continued throughout 1943, but with the concentration of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, there was little sense of urgency. Plans for a continuous belt of fortifications were still largely unrealized, and the wall was in most sectors far from complete. Then, in December, Hitler ordered that work on the wall be stepped up. Priority, henceforth, was to be given to the defense of the West. German strategic planning was based on a number of assumptions. The first was that landings would most likely be made within range of fighter cover from bases in England. This circumscribed an area from the Gulf of St. Malo to the Dutch coast. A second assumption was that the Allies would try to seize harbour facilities for the quick reinforcement of their assault forces. These were most extensive in the ports of the Pas de Calais. An attack here would benefit from the greatest depth of fighter cover, require the shortest transit time from Britain to the continent, and provide an ideal springboard for a rapid advance into Germany. Yet while this formed their basic underlying strategy, the Germans were also aware of the possibility of support or diversionary landings, and of the Allies' ability to provide air cover from carriers, and they were consequently compelled to maintain large forces in comparatively quiet sectors of the coast. For such a broad deployment to be effective, it was imperative that the landings be contested from the outset at the water's edge. Every beach between Denmark and the Brittany coast was to be made impassable. Civilian, military, and conscript labour would be called upon. Thousands of new artillery, machine gun and mortar positions were to be built by April at the latest. Every port and harbour was to be turned into a fortress, and the garrison supplied with sufficient stores to withstand a siege. Priority was to be given to the Pas de Calais. During the first few months of 1944, immense efforts were made to strengthen the coastal defences in anticipation of an attack in the spring or summer. Naval batteries and heavy artillery were housed in nearly impregnable concrete bunkers. Many of these guns were capable of ranging far out to sea and engaging the most heavily armed warships. On the beaches themselves, an intricate array of hazards, obstacles and traps was set out. Behind these were minefields, anti-tank ditches and ramps, blockhouses, and entanglements of barbed wire. By the end of May, the fortifications in the Pas de Calais would be almost complete. Those in the Normandy sector, while still far from complete, were nevertheless formidable. During April and May, German armoured formations in the west were augmented by transfers from the Eastern Front and by the arrival of new tanks and self-propelled guns from Germany. As D-Day approached, German strength in the west increased from 53 to 50.